You're listening to the Monday American podcast. This episode is brought to you by Studio Headphones. And what Studio Headphones does is change the way that people use headphones and look at headphones entirely. With Studio, you are no longer forced into this odd binary choice between style or sound. With Studio, you get both. Studio headphones take their Scandinavian roots and they emphasize the modern design they get from that Scandinavian heritage to give you stylish headphones. And when you combine that with the ability to go head to head with the best sounding headphones out there, you get the quality of Studio. I have two pairs now. One's over the ear and one's an in-ear earbud model. They're both Bluetooth. They both have phenomenal battery life and sound quality that makes me, one of the pickiest of audiophiles, happy with how they sound. So they sound good and they make me look stylish, which is, believe me, not an easy task by any means. So go to studio.com/US and get 15% off of any order with the promo code MondayAmerican in all caps. You can also just click the link in the show notes to get you right there, and you'll get 15% off any order, and that includes free worldwide shipping, and that is, once again, studio.com. The promo code is Monday American in all caps for 15% off any order.
You're listening to The Monday American.
Now, very quickly, before we begin, I'd like to just say a quick congratulations to Tommy Colavito and his fiancée Stephanie on their new engagement. Tommy is a friend and a fan of the show and diligently wears his Monday American t-shirt while working out. And I know that because my brother-in-law happened to spot him in his shirt working out at the same gym with him and let me know, and we were able to figure out it was him. But Tommy did just recently get engaged, so just a quick shout out and congratulations to you, and a thank you for wearing the sweet, sweet podcast merchandise, which I am sure has led to throngs of women just overwhelming you with counter engagement offers. I'm sure that podcast shirt has just been Stephanie's, one of the banes of her existence, because of how many women it just must have had thrown at your feet because of you simply wearing it. And if you're interested in getting a shirt for yourself, you can do so at you can go to themondayamerican.com and click on merchandise or merch, and it'll take you right to our show's page where you can get shirts, coffee mugs, notebooks. You can even get baby clothes. And yes, my newborn niece is about to be photographed in one of the said Monday American baby clothing items, and of course it's going to be amazing. So again, thank you to Tommy and congratulations. So I guess to start off this program, I should say that I am deeply, deeply sorry for how long it's taken to get this episode out. I am a massive fan of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and I promise I am not adopting his timetable for new episodes to be released. It has just been a hectic, chaotic array of life that I've been dealing with, and a lot of things have been putting this episode off from coming out, and I do apologize, and no, it will not be the new norm, nor should it ever be something that happens again. So I apologize, and I wanted to say thank you for sticking with the show, because it has been, quite some time, and I know that if you're like me, your podcast feed is something that you cherish and don't allow new shows to breach into lightly. So if there's someone that's given up on the show because of the lack of new episodes, I'd appreciate you letting them know that we're back and we're here doing new content. And if you are able to share any of our social media posts about this episode, please log on to Facebook and Twitter and do so and help spread the word. So again, my deepest apologies for the overly long delay in getting a new episode out to you guys. I hope this is worth the wait. This episode was originally requested by Justin Kelly of Juice in the Morning podcast, which you should listen to if you don't already. Juice in the Morning podcast. No, they did not sponsor the show. It just happens to be a good show. And he reached out wanting to know more about the Great Depression, mainly because his grandfather was a person who lived through that horrific time period and that American tragedy. And it's taken me a while to firstly commit to doing this topic. And obviously, like I just mentioned, it's taken me quite some time in actually getting it recorded, edited, and out there for you. But it's the story of one of the greatest American tragedies, for certainly the greatest and worst American economic disaster in our country's history. And I hope that I do justice to the stories of the people who lived at this time, because the whole tagline of the show is making sure that the story never gets taken out or left out of history. And that's something I just want to make sure I get right here, especially because this isn't my forte. I definitely have a over-reliance on just covering military history, something I try to be cognizant of. And I apologize for not spreading out my wings a little bit more and diversifying the content for you guys. I know that the Cowboys and Indians episode, which I think was the last one that was not a military episode, was very, very well received. And I will just put down my own thinking cap, because it obviously doesn't work very well, and just begin to listen to what you guys want. So keep the suggestions coming in. You can email them to contact@themondayamerican.com, or you can send us a message on the Twitter or Facebook page, whatever floats your boat. Just let us know what you want to hear. Now, if you're like me and like, how I was in high school, when you hear the words, the Great Depression, or you think about that whole story, your eyes might begin to immediately glaze over, and you might immediately just begin to tune out. That was probably my biggest challenge with this episode, was making sure that I didn't lose my own fascination with history or my own ability to find the interesting story and be hooked into that interesting story. And like anything with history, I guess it goes without saying now that context is vitally important. And you have to remember the time that this happened to America and how much that played into effect to make these tragedies just so much worse. It was a time in the post-World War I era where we had just thought that we had seen the worst war that would ever happen in the lifetime of humanity. It had just came to an end, an abrupt end, mind you. And there were revolutions happening all over Russia. There were revolutions happening in Germany, and there were massive depressions worldwide in the fallout of the war. Now, this was, to America's benefit, a post-war period of amazing boom and economic prosperity. We were the only nation really untouched by the war on the home front, I guess you could say, that was able to survive post-war and provide an international market for the other recovering nations. So while everyone else was rebuilding and just trying to figure out how to continue on, the United States was there to be the trade power of the world in a time where there was a vacuum for that role. Remember that England before this was basically the world power that was able to offer pretty much everything that we took over for them post World War I. And at that point, it would have been, on Great Britain to fill that powerhouse role of the world economy, or the leading economy in the world. But they were just not in a place that they could do it. They had lost millions of men and millions of resources and economic power and stability to World War I, whereas the United States, yes, we lost a ton of those people, but the war never touched us on the home front. Our industries and manufacturing capabilities were really just fine. If anything, they got better, and we were able to see the massive economic and technological advancements that World War I benefited us, directly. And keep in mind, World War I, one of the many reasons it stands out of World War II is because it started at the beginning of the 1900s. And in 1911, a warship or a battleship that was being produced in the beginning of its production stages, by the time it would come out in the war, it was already a technologically inferior and genuinely useless product. So keep in mind that the advancements of technology in the Industrial Revolution were at such a great pace that hardly anyone could keep up. And that's one of the reasons why World War I, which we'll do a series on eventually, don't worry, that's one of the reasons why it was such a unique war. I mean, just to put it in perspective, Great Britain had a group of battleships. They had basically an entire flotilla, an armada, if you will, of battleships that were produced, I think, 2 years before they were even put to use, because by the time they came out and were done, they were, as Winston Churchill put, literally scrap metal. And the only way they ended up being used, because they were just sitting there floating in a harbor, literally as floating scrap metal, was because they wanted to basically send a fleet down this narrow corridor of waterway that was mined heavily. And their idea was, hey, why don't we use those ships that are literally useless as the lead group so that we can just take out some of the mines before they hit the good stuff. And when you're dealing with a world like that, where the technology is just so quickly advancing, it's kind of mind-boggling to really conceive and make sure that you're putting yourself in the perspective of the people that were living there at the time. And with that said, I'll do my best to try to bring that out throughout this story, but just keep in mind that this was a period of rapid advancements. In America, among the citizens, it was a massive increase in the standard of living that seemed to just be raising hope nationwide. It was the 1920s. It was the decade in which Americans began traveling the country in automobiles, and the decade that they began to prefer the telephone to a post-church visit. Now, probably the only single thing that was growing and rising faster than the technological boons of that decade was the stock market. And the faster it rose towards the end of the decade, the faster this entirely new generation of Americans turned to it. And for the sake of brevity and time, I'll be referring a lot to the market in this episode, but the Dow is the one that I'll be referring to the mostly. And for those like me who are fairly stock market illiterate, the Dow is simply an index that is used to gauge, at that time, I believe it was the top 30 businesses. But it's essentially the index at which you can use to gauge the market's health overall. So I believe today there's several different branches of that, but the Dow essentially was taking the top 30 largest public companies, plus some more in the country, and just giving a report on their stock index and how well they're performing, what's going up, what's going down, and you would use it in order to just kind of get a look on the market as a whole. So there were companies like Ford that were just going through massive expansion, and Dodge and Buick and GM. And at this time, there were a ton of companies in America that were just exploding with productivity gains and growth. And as they grew, the Dow would march upward more aggressively from 155 in February of 27 to over 200 by the end of that year in 1927. And investors were now just wildly pouring money into it. They had discovered that they could buy shares without the cash to pay for those shares, and they would simply borrow on the margin of growth and hope that the rise in the stock prices would cover their loans. The margin rule was really not a new one, and it still is in practice today, but the investors that were using that rule were. And stock pickers were borrowing so much from the brokers to buy the stocks that the amount, which was later quantified by the great economist David Hale, was an equivalent to a full 18% of gross domestic product. And if that doesn't raise some eyebrows, maybe you just don't follow the GDP like many do, but that is an absolutely astronomical amount of GDP to be borrowing and to be in credit for. And this period became known in short as the Gilded Age. It was generally proving to be gilded for even the average very poor man. Groups that were hoping to rise out of poverty were also doing very well, and the general conviction was that the individual effort was the key to advancement. And I think that still does ring true today, but we were about to see that no matter the amount of the individual effort that is put forth, sometimes it's just not enough. Now, one of the hallmark symbols of this individual success in this era was the amount of immigration that was happening in the United States. This is the period when Ellis Island was overflowing with immigrants coming in looking to fulfill the American dream. In New York, Italian Americans became symbols of success, and they represented the state in Congress as a Republican representative as well. So it was a group that was, or many groups that were coming in and finding their niche in the American life. The paramount symbol of immigration independence was the Bank of the United States, which served immigrants and within a few years was establishing 60 offices spread out around New York. The Bank of the United States, which was not the Bank of the United States or, the Bank of America, it was a member of the New York Clearinghouse and therefore outside the established network of banks, and indeed is one likely reason for the bank's official sounding name. It was to signal that the bank was part of the American dream and as close as a private bank could come to being as trustworthy as those who trusted the government back in that day. And although immigration played a massive part of the story and ultimately the tragedy for those who experienced it, African Americans were not left out of this story either. They were migrating from the South and they were coming up north in droves. They were giving up homes and sometimes even land to just establish themselves in an entirely new place at the time to them, which were northern cities. And at the time, that seemed like a very wise step. We can always look back and hindsight can be 20/20 on most things, but like on the website and in the show's tag, it's not always 20/20. Sometimes it takes stepping into the shoes to see just how it all shook out and played out so that you can really understand. But overall, for the Black American segment of that demographic, for Black Americans, life expectancy was rising. Most importantly noted was that they were able to find work at just about the same exact rates that white laborers were. Data from the 1930 census would show Black unemployment nationally standing just slightly below white unemployment. And for 1930, that is quite an accomplishment to stand on, truly. And Calvin Coolidge, he was of the same party of Lincoln. He wasn't content with that. He wanted to see an end to the lynchings in the South, but he was not clear, well, at the time it wasn't clear, whether Congress had the authority to reach over the states and do so. In December of 23, he said that, quote, "The Congress ought to exercise all its powers of prevention and punishment against the hideous crimes of lynching," end quote. But Congress wasn't exactly inclined to act, and here his federalism seemed a bit disingenuous when he was preaching for small government. But it's neither here nor there. I wanted to include that portion in so that you could see that this was a truly American dream era of America and that everyone was thriving. It wasn't just some or, one small group versus everyone else. Every person in America felt hope and they felt promise and they felt like there was a bright future ahead. Now, the transition of Calvin Coolidge to the man who would replace him, who was Herbert Hoover, was one of the first crucial steps in this entire Great Depression story. And although Coolidge didn't exactly want Hoover to be the one to supplant him, he didn't necessarily want to stay in office either. And remember, at this time, the amendment was not written into the Constitution yet for a limit of 2 terms for the presidential office. It was just kind of up in the air. And he said in a very prescient quote, Calvin Coolidge said, quote, "It is difficult for men in high office to avoid the malady of self-delusion. They are always surrounded by worshipers. They are constantly, and for the most part, sincerely assured of their greatness. The presidential office is of such nature that it is difficult to conceive how one man can successfully serve the country for a term of more than 8 years. Essentially, end quote, I apologize. I'm trying to get better at ending quotes for you guys so it's not confusing, but essentially what he was saying was that all too often, the man became the office and he didn't want to become such a man. So he announced to the public in the summer of 1927 that he would not be running for president again in 1928. And that's what opened the door for his replacement to be, which was Herbert Hoover. And although there was this massive growth and boon to the American economy, there were a few areas where there was some concern. Namely, farms, especially in the late 20s, had falling grain prices, and there were a lot of people who could see that that was going to become an issue. Another area that concerned a lot of people in the country were the utilities, and they noted that the prosperity seen in the cities was not really as visible out in the rural areas of the country, and that rapid advance of utilities in the United States did not seem rapid enough to the farming crowd for even the 1920s. Most farms didn't have power still. One of the economists of the day, Frederick Jackson Turner, had developed a thesis that ended up sticking with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, for the rest of his entire life. And I'm entering it here because this is just kind of the chronological event timeline as it happened. And his thesis was this: as the American frontier closed, the United States was entering a period where the old rules did not hold. And as an undergraduate, Roosevelt had also studied with a monetary expert named Oliver M.W. Sprague, and at least thought about those money problems in the farms and how to fix it. It was something that these men, they believed it was the responsibility of the idealists they considered themselves to act on those concerns and frustrations and worries. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the episode, but that's a point to hold on to, because it's not often that a single economist's theorist sticks with one man who ends up becoming the president for the longest duration of anyone ever, and will be the longest duration ever of the office holder. And it so rapidly and so drastically affected the country on magnitudes that are hard to even comprehend. So I wanted to point that out to you just in the beginning to make sure it's a point that you keep in the back of your mind as we go through. And for men like Roosevelt and Turner and Oliver M.W. Sprague, the answer for these utilities types of questions was in wider government involvement, especially in the power industry. And this was what nearly all of those in the Progressive Party or in the progressive movement of that day believed. Now moving on to that, let's fast forward a little bit farther ahead in time to October of 1929. The unemployment average had risen slightly from 3% to 5%. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the Dow, was at 343 on October 1st. And on that dark Tuesday, that Black Tuesday, in October of 1929, when the market did indeed crash, everyone in the country still had hope and a sense that everything was going to be okay. The headline of the New York Times that day rang out, quote, "Closing rally vigorous," even as the closing back on August 20th had closed at a high of 368, and the market had gone even higher earlier in that month to 381. And it made sense that there would be spectacular drops all month, right up to this closing on the 29th of October, when the Dow was down to 230. And that is a massive drop of a market index, especially in a single day. And as the Treasury officials at the time of Hoover's administration, which was 6 months into its term, had told the paper the preceding Thursday that the losses didn't matter anyways because they were just, quote unquote, paper losses. They weren't real. They weren't tangible. They were just, issues that were going to come back up naturally. And Hoover himself was a reflection of the country that most of the nation didn't really share the view that things were going bad. They shared the view that things were okay and that they were going to bounce back. Hoover was planning to spend the weekend at the White House with an author who had just finished a biography of him during his campaign, and the Treasury Secretary was spending the weekend away. It was just kind of business as usual and casual attitudes that were held towards the market and the crash that day. But it would be a Tuesday that would mark the beginning of a very long disaster, the worst economic disaster, arguably of the world, certainly for America, that would quickly turn into panic, and those casual attitudes would not last very long at all. In one of the more infamous instances on Wall Street that became famous, probably most famous, was the pair of men who committed suicide by leaping out of the window while holding hands, essentially symbolizing that they had maintained a joint venture in business and they would go out together in life. And this was the kind of anecdotal tragedy that would come to be tragically symbolic of the stock market crash. And just a few weeks after the crash, on November 13th of 1929, the New York City chief medical officer reported that there had been 44 suicides in the preceding 4 weeks in Manhattan. So there was pandemonium, and it wasn't exactly creeping into the American mental forefront. As for some of the banks of the time, there were some that were already starting to fail, but the rate was not outside the normal bank failure rate for the decade of the whole of the 1920s. Total commercial bank failures for 1929 would actually be lower than the same statistic for 24, 26, and 27. So the nation's first impulse was correct. Washington might not have needed to do much. And the miracle of the 1920s had followed a rough downturn at the start of the decade and had, risen from the ashes like a phoenix and did a 180 turnaround comeback. Such crashes, or as they were known at the time with panics, they didn't make a lengthy slump a inevitable thing that you were going to have to trog through. And perhaps all that was needed now was for the owners to sell some of their holdings so that the market could find its own bottom. And this is what a lot of the economists of the time would recommend, that stockholders, banks, and farmers just begin to liquidate their holdings. And, that phrase "to liquidate" often sounded harsh, but it also represented an old and important argument. Uncertainty was one of the market's problems. Only when stocks or wages were marked to market and found their bottom would they be able to rise again. In the recent rise in the stock market, they would argue it was not something that was, up to the chance of a game of roulette. It had reflected something genuine, which was the productivity gains and the hope for future new ones. New consumer products made everyone aware of the potential in economy for profits, and the utilities in the world of Insull, Loomis, Bond-Bright, and Wilkie, these are all economists. It was a good example that electrification had dramatically brightened the 1920s, but there was still 50% of the country that were waiting on power. So in the bull market of the 1920s, it wasn't an empty speculative bubble. It was just the market's best effort to quantify the value to America of the potential of the recent and future innovations of the time. It was the breakthrough innovation like the 1920s that was entirely rational for stock prices to just bust through old barriers, high and low. But even so, given that, people were starting to panic. To give you an idea of the ebbs and flows of the stock market and the Dow Jones Industrial Average, in 1927, the Dow Jones crossed the 200 mark. And from 200 in the spring of 27, it moved to 381, which was nearly doubling itself again after it had previously done so in 27. And at the summer of 29, it doubled again. So the increase seemed so steep to not somehow be economically and morally suspect. And this massive increase was the concern of many that thought, and Hoover was one of these people, that thought it was due to the country being in the dangerous throes of a inflation crisis. So as the days passed on from Black Thursday, I might have said Black Tuesday earlier. If I did, I apologize. It was Black Thursday when the market crashed in October of 29. As the days passed, more bad news was coming in, especially for Hoover. London began to take notice and was concerned. A correspondent for a London newspaper wrote, quote, "Fear for our prosperity." end quote, which was on their minds. And it reflected the Great Britain's overall attitude towards its concerns that the U.S. had incomes that would fall so much that Americans would no longer be able to buy European exports. And remember, by this time, they were just starting to build that back up. So that was a very big deal. I mean, that still is a very big deal today, but even more so, the stakes were just that much higher back then. Only prosperity had made Americans willing to buy expensive European goods despite the extra tariffs on them. And with this drop in the stock market and the drop of these incomes, that same writer noted that, quote, the tariff wall will become temporarily insurmountable. Now we know now that this inflation theory, it didn't really hold water, but the New York Fed and others, like I said, Hoover, they believed in that inflation theory and thought that more cash in the market would exacerbate that inflation. So the Fed therefore steered away from the old gold standard tradition, which we also know now is a very bad idea, and it sterilized the effect of all that new money by selling bonds, which in effect soaked up money from the economy to offset any monetary expansion. So looking at a broader period, you could see that the trend was even more marked. The actual money supply available dropped by nearly 4% at the end of 1928 and by the end of 1930. And that sterilization of cash program, it more than offset some small interest rate cuts taken shortly after the crash. So instead of loosening in a time of trouble, the Fed was actually tightening up. And the more Hoover thought about it, the more he too liked this idea of a war against inflation. Market fever was in any case the sort of thing Hoover deplored, and he had been complaining about the abuse of Americans towards credit for 4 years already. But in fact, it was much more than inflation, and inflation had almost nothing to do with it. And it perhaps marked the stark contrast of the thinkers in Washington versus the people on the ground when on that same night, the president learned that Robert Searly, I believe is how you pronounce it, he was the president of the Rochester Gas and Electric Corporation. He gassed himself to death after confronting more than $1 million in losses in a single month. That death specifically seems to be a ironic metaphor for the failing of the utilities industry as a whole at that time. Now, at the beginning of that same month in November of 29, Hoover received a confidential report from federal officials that the market readjustment that they were working on was not completed, but would instead last months more. So the mood was shifting to crisis, and Hoover felt energized with another rescue opportunity in the coming future. He would later write, quote, "The primary question at once arose as to whether the president and the federal government should undertake to mitigate and remedy the evils. We had to pioneer a new field," end quote. So right away, in November of 29, Hoover pushed to expand an existing public buildings program by the healthy sum of $423 million on the theory that the spending would boost the economy, and in fact, it had almost no effect whatsoever. Before a year would pass from that fateful October 29 crash, Hoover had done damage to the stock market and overall economic situation of America on 3 different fronts. He intervened in business, he signed into law a horrific, destructive tariff, and he assailed the stock markets. So Hoover believed that business spending might make a difference, and he thought he might be able to cajole or bully the industrial world and the labor leaders into pulling the economy back to recovery. And less than a month after Black Tuesday I think I even just corrected myself to Thursday. It was Black Tuesday. I'm sorry. I'm not sure why I keep going back and forth. He called a conference of railroad presidents in the cabinet room of the White House. Railroads mattered to an extent that it's hard to even really imagine in today's world and standards. But at the time, they were the principal means of transport for both people and goods across the nation. The president asked the executives to sustain construction. And later that week, industry leaders announced they planned a full $1 billion in outlays, which is an amount equal to more than a third of what the federal government had to spend on all its budget projections. I'm laughing as I read that because of how much money it is. in 1929. So that's a amazing amount of money. And then 2 days later, Hoover announced that he was going to do something radical. And he accompanied all these layoffs that he noted. This time, every instinct to him, it must be different. The wages, he thought, must be kept in place. And businesses in trouble might reduce hours to share jobs, but the general push must be to keep higher wages and keep up employment. In Hoover's wages idea, they sounded good to some, but when they really just didn't make a whole lot of sense. To force businesses to go on a spending spree when it didn't want to was hurtful for business, obviously, and in some areas, wages especially, the president's policy was dramatically counterproductive. As the crash continued, profits began to drop, yet businesses could not adjust their wages. If they wanted to be good citizens, they had to keep their pledge to Hoover and sustain employment and wages. The president was essentially requiring that companies take hits in their profits instead of employment. And so by the winter of 1931, state and county governments were beginning to give up on handling the hunger and the homelessness that was spreading rampantly throughout America. And this was just a few years after the Gilded Age, or the Gilded Decade, as they were calling it. And the people were giving up as well. If their leadership couldn't understand the details of the monetary problem, then how could they? Many Americans didn't even think that a new institution like the Fed could do either much good or much bad. The Federal Reserve Board decisions and pronouncements were read by very, very few people. All people saw was that things were not working. In Utah, 32 of 105 banks had failed. Wages dropped nearly half their old level for those who even still had a job, and the unemployment rate for the state was rising up into the 30 percentile range. And what's more, adding insult to injury, I guess, across the Midwest and the West, there was now a growing drought, and one that would last for all of 1930, 31, and 32, with record low amounts of rainfall. One writer wrote of the growing disaster as it approached his very window step, and he said, quote, "A sprawling Hooverville soon spread along the riverbank across the railroad tracks. Before long, there were thousands of shacks put together out of orange crates, beaten cans, old pieces of rubber, leather, or cloth, their denizens gone back to caveman status, scrounging in neighborhood garbage heaps for food or fuel. It felt as though a sense of jeopardy was about to open." End quote. And his conclusion was not far off from the actual truth, and in many ways it might have been an underestimation of the jeopardy that was about to befall America. A story from the New York Times in 1931 on Christmas Eve carries what seemed like the new kind of American story, and probably the most succinct synopsis of this entire crisis. It told the story of a couple that had gone from New York City and retreated to a stranger's empty cottage on the edge of the Catskill Mountains to die. The young couple had made their way into the area in search for employment, investing all but 25 cents of their cash on the journey, but had failed to find any work at all. Finding none, the Times reported, quote, "They went into the cottage preferring to starve rather than beg," end quote. A police officer discovered the man. His name was Wilfred Wild, and his wife in the lakeside cabin after 3 days, at which point the wife, who was 23 years old, was too weak to walk. And in the tragic conclusion to this article, it ends, quote, "An effort is being made to obtain employment for them, but if this fails, they will be sent back to New York City," end quote. It seemed that American common sense was failing. The downturn was proving the falsehood of pragmatism's old thesis that all lines end eventually. And perhaps the country was now entering this new territory, this realm of theory where lines never ended and they must always be addressed. And these lines that they were on were the rail lines of tragedy. And right in the middle of this period of tragedy where Americans were starving to death and it seemed like there was no hope at all, we had a leadership change in the country. And it was time for an election. And at a time where there were literal Hoovervilles, shanty towns that were forming of people who were starving to death without a job, It seemed like Hoover's days were numbered. And so they were. The United States elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, to the office of president. And it's maybe unfair to say that Roosevelt won specifically because of, Hoover and the situation in the country. Roosevelt tapped into something that was a message that the people were willing to hear. He did it over a medium that was unlike any other that had been done before. He did it over the radio. And, FDR is famous for his fireside chats of World War II. Well, he began that radio prowess and expertise well before the election even started. And after Roosevelt was elected, he took a dramatic shift in what he was focusing on for policies, and it was a shift that had never happened in America before. He would attack the businessman, and he would attack the business and big labor and any big type of industry possible. In one speech, he said, quote, "Depressions could and did come and go, but they could not alter the fundamental fact that most of the people lived partly by selling their labor and partly by extracting their livelihood from the soil." So by now, he was building on the ideas of his old professor, Frederick Jackson Turner. Roosevelt reminded any of his listeners on the radio, which were, for the most part, the better part of the country, the importance of the fact that, quote, "our last frontier," as he called it, had long since been reached. It was time for what he called the, quote, "princes of property," which was to say the wealthy. It was time for them to share their resources. Growth would not provide for the poor, and what he believed was only redistribution could. Now, for the people at the time, it's a message that probably rang pretty true and was a welcome message to hear. Unfortunately, it was this very message and his methods that would not only not stop the Depression, but it would make it worse and extend it for years. So all that said, it's probably needless to say that the interim period between Hoover and Roosevelt and that lame duck period, where Hoover was going out and Roosevelt was coming in, it was a period of uncertainty to say the least. So when the banking crisis was growing worse, Hoover tried contacting Roosevelt, even at one point sending a lengthy letter. Historians later noted that Hoover's sense of urgency even showed up in the way he addressed the letter, misspelling Roosevelt's name. He spelled it, quote, "Roosvelt." But Roosevelt was cruising off the coast of Florida. Hoover had expected to meet him on his return, but Roosevelt really wasn't interested in cooperation. So we never will truly know all his motives because he died while in office and never had the chance to write his memoirs, which is really where presidents get a chance to reflect on the past, kind of explain some of their decisions, and obviously you have to take it with a grain of salt, but it gives a lot of insight to us later, and especially historians of the period, and they're able to decipher between the lines of what was really going on. But it was clear right now that a crisis could only strengthen his mandate for action after his inauguration in March. So Hoover was becoming incensed at the silence of Roosevelt, and he took to documenting his own goodwill in the name of an accurate history. In late February, one of the lowest moments of the Depression as the Dow stood at just above 50, a manufacturer would leave a message for Hoover. He had had a meeting with Tugwell, who had confirmed that the new administration had no interest whatsoever in cooperating with the old. Hoover wrote a formal letter to the manufacturer to put on record what the man had reported to his secretary, where he says, quote, "I beg to acknowledge your telephone message received through Mr. Jocelyn as follows. Professor Tugwell, advisor to Franklin D. Roosevelt, had lunch with me. He said they were fully aware of the bank situation and that it would undoubtedly collapse in a few days, which would place the responsibility in the lap of President Hoover. I can say emphatically that he breathes with infamous politics devoid of every atom of patriotism." End quote. And that is quite a charge to issue, but it was a charge nonetheless that at the time and looking back on it, it seemed pretty accurate, and it doesn't seem, out of class to issue. And now it's at this point where if you're a big fan of FDR, you're probably not going to like the rest of this episode. FDR has gone down in history largely as the triumphant leader that led us through World War II until he passed away from polio April 12th of 1944. But it's his actions before World War II that really allude to the type of person he was and the type of beliefs that he held as the executive office. And he alludes to it right away from his first inaugural address in 1933. I believe he gave it in March. And the way that he justifies this power grab that he's after is what is truly telling of the man in the way that he saw the office, or the duties of the office, and his plans to get the country out of the Depression. He was seeking broad executive power to essentially wage a war against the Depression. This was a very welcome message. It was something that the people wanted to hear, and they were frankly just really tired of the Depression. I mean, wouldn't you be? Can you blame them? So we see right away in his first inaugural address where he says, quote, "And it is to be hoped
that the normal balance of executive and legislative authority may be wholly equal, wholly adequate to meet the unprecedented task before us. But it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. For the trust reposed in me, I will return the courage and the devotion that befit the time. I can do no less.
What FDR saw as the solution to a problem that he thought was a problem that government couldn't fix, he saw the solution as more government. And unfortunately for him and the millions of people in the United States that were suffering from the Depression, that just was not the case. And now there's forces that are outside of the control of really anyone. Keep in mind while we go over this that in those first couple months and for the rest of 1933, really, the country was experiencing the worst unemployment numbers in its history. Now, even though the records weren't kept as well as they are today, they just weren't quantified as well as today. But even the most conservative of estimates come back with figures of 3 in 10 workers unemployed. Folks, that's 30% of the country in a conservative estimate unemployed. So keep that in mind as we carry on in this story and fast forward a little bit in time and we start to deal with the forces of Mother Nature, which made the Depression go from a disaster to an absolute unmitigated nightmare. So in a period when joblessness was at 30%, there was no food, people couldn't afford the food that they could find anyways, and the farmers didn't even have electricity in the best of times, the country was hit in 1936 with the worst drought in America's history. And it caused the hottest summer on record. That June, 8 states experienced temperatures at 110 degrees or more. And in July, the heat wave hit 12 more states. And just to give you an idea, in Texas in August, they saw 120 degree record-breaking temperatures. Now, on top of it being one of the largest heat waves and droughts, It was also the deadliest heat wave in United States history. It killed 1,693 people on its own. And tragically, another 3,500, that's 3,500 people, drowned because they were trying to cool off. How hot does it have to be that you drown yourself by trying to cool off? Whether it's drinking water or finding some water somewhere and just trying to cool off, and you're so exhausted from the heat that you actually drown. This became known as the Dust Bowl, and it was the worst drought in North America, the North American continent, in 300 years. To make matters worse, there were 4 waves of drought. One was from 1930 to 31, another in 34, another in 36, and the last one was between 39 and 1940. So, think about this. The affected regions from each drought, they couldn't even recover at all before the next one was hitting. And in 1934, the drought covered 75% of the entire country, affecting 27 states in total. And by far the worst hit was the Oklahoma Panhandle, which is where you get stories of the Dust Bowl. And the stories of living with this dust are, they're unimaginable. Hazel Lucas Shaw would remember watching the dust seep through the thinnest cracks in the walls of their rental house. It would spread all over their china, into the bedroom, onto their sheets. And when she would wake up in the morning, the only clean part of her pillow was the outline of her head. Can you imagine so much dust that the only part of your pillow clean is what is being covered by your head? She said she remembers taping all the windows around the outer edge of the doors, but the dust would always find a way in. And she learned never to set a dinner plate out until ready to eat. She learned to cook with pots covered and to leave no standing water out very long, or there was so much dust in the air that the standing water would turn to mud. This is just dust dominating every aspect of life. The roads were fine in parts and they were rutted and hard, but a few miles later down the road, it would disappear under just waves of drifting dust. Imagine dust flowing through the air so thick it looks like liquid. You were unable to see more than a car length ahead, and the Shaw family, Hazel Lucas, they would follow telephone poles to get from one town to the next. This is not just your dust or a dust storm or a dirt storm, sandstorm. This is an entirely new type of disaster to deal with, on top of the worst economic disaster in the nation's history, and on top of the fact that most of the people in your house are probably unemployed. Any money that you did have was gone because the banks closed, and you're scavenging for food, and now you can't grow any on your own, and others can't grow any for you because this liquid dust storm is just ravaging the nation. One man in Texas named Fred Folkers remembers spending most of his days shoveling dust. He says the shovel was his rescue tool. He never went anywhere without it. In a long day's blow, the drift could pile, he says, 4 feet or more against fences that were clogged with tumbleweeds, which would then create sand dunes of dust and send more dust off in other directions. Some mornings, he didn't even recognize his own lands, as the shifting dunes of dust produced dust mounds with ripples holding the imprint of the winds from overnight. Other mornings, he says his car was entirely covered, and after he wiped his car clean, it was hell to get it started again because the dust is clogging the carburetor. At the end of April of 1933, with no green on his land and no rain coming from the weather, another dust storm came in that lasted a whole 20 hours without ceasing. For most of the storm, the winds would blow at more than 40 miles an hour, and they were strong and abrasive enough to combine with the dust and scrape the paint off of Fred Folkers' house. And it would even get into the digestive system of the cattle. People would watch the horizon darken with the approach of these, what they would call them, dusters or rollers, and they just knew there was no escape. They could not stay outside for fear of getting lost or choking on a blast of gritty, dusty air. And while they were indoors, it would offer some protection from the wind, but it was never any respite from the never-ending, unceasing, fine granules of dust. And I tell you those stories just to make sure that you understand, going through high school and you study the Great Depression in America, if you're going to high school in America, you hear the Dust Bowl, the Great Dust Bowl, and you've seen The Grapes of Wrath. That movie is a great depiction of life in the Dust Bowl America during the Depression. But to really put it into perspective, it's these stories that give a life to the Dust Bowl. It gives meaning to what that actually meant. I mean, this is an unmitigated nightmare on top of an economic disaster. I mean, it could not have come at a worse time, and it was responsible for killing thousands upon thousands of Americans. Now, despite all this, FDR had to make a move, and he had to do something to try to get the country out of this depression, and his answer was the famous New Deal. Now, without a doubt, during the entire New Deal period, which essentially is from 1933 until the onset of World War II in roughly 39, 40, 41, the most troubling part of that period was the persistence of the high unemployment throughout that period as a whole. From 1934 to 40, the average annual unemployment rate was 17.2%. And at no point at all during the 1930s did the unemployment numbers go below 14% of the nation. I mean, even in 1941, in the middle of the massive buildup for World War II, unemployment was still at 9.9%, and living standards among the people of America, they remained at depression levels until after the war was over. Now, the market did pick up in 1937. There was a slight peak, but because of the actions of FDR and the methods he took, it was followed by another crash. And as the Nobel laureate Milton Friedman put it, quote, "The only occasion in our record when one deep depression followed immediately on the heels of another." And that was this time in 1937. And largely it was because FDR took the wrong steps to try to fix the Great Depression. And it's hard to blame him because he did have motives that were true, but his methods were extremely flawed. During the Great Depression, in a time when there was no money, FDR tripled the taxes. Taxes were tripled on businesses, on income. Well, they were created on income. They were tripled on sales tax, on gift tax, on estate tax. Every tax there was, they were tripled. And all these taxes ended up meaning that there was less capital for businesses to create jobs, and people had less money in their pockets. And as if that wasn't bad enough, FDR also increased the cost and risk of employing people as a business. So there really shouldn't have been any surprise at all when the unemployment rate remained incredibly high and stubbornly so. In a study that was done about the New Deal much later on down the road in 1997, two economists named Richard K. Vedder and Lowell E. Galloway, they took a look at the New Deal policies, and they came up with their conclusion, which was, quote, "New Deal policies systematically use the power of the state to intervene in labor markets in a manner to raise wages and labor costs, prolonging the misery of the Great Depression and creating a situation where many people were living in rising prosperity at a time when millions of others were suffering severe deprivation. Of the 10 years of unemployment rates over 10% during the Depression, fully 8 were during the Roosevelt administration." End quote. So these two economists, Vedder and Galloway, they estimated that by 1940, unemployment was 8 percentage points higher than it would have been in the absence of the New Deal policies. So when millions of people had little to no money, the New Deal era and the policies it brought with it, it made practically everything more expensive, in turn making practically everything even farther out of reach. And like I mentioned before and showed you the clip of his speech, what was happening and what this New Deal was, it was government control. It wasn't takeover. It wasn't a full-scale government takeover or control like you would see in the Soviet Union around the same time, but it came closer than anybody had thought possible. An economic historian named Ellis W. Hawley wrote, quote, "Perhaps the greatest defect in these limited planning measures," talking about the New Deal, "was their tendency towards restriction, their failure to provide any incentive for expansion when an expanding economy, was the crying need of the time," end quote. And so as a cure for the Great Depression, FDR thought that government spending would foot the bill, but it didn't. In 1933, the federal government outlays were only $4.5 billion, and in 1940, they were $9.4 billion. So, in a sense, he more than doubled the federal spending, and still the unemployment remained just as stubbornly high as before. FDR had assumed an unprecedented, arbitrary power that was supposedly needed to get America out of the Great Depression. And it's hard to blame the Congress at the time and the people for letting him do that, because it was the worst disaster, other than a war, that we've ever experienced as a nation. So at this point, they were willing to try just about anything to get out of it. And so amidst this sweeping power grab, FDR was incredibly impatient still with the American democracy. Even though his party, the Democratic Party, controlled Congress at the time, he issued, frankly, a staggering number of executive orders, totaling 3,728 altogether, which is more than all the executive orders issued by his successors Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton combined. Just let that sink in. That is a staggering amount of executive orders. To go from 1933, when you're inaugurated, and not have the amount of executive orders outdo your own until the late 90s, that should raise some eyebrows. And that's just not a wise policy. And it's not how the Constitution was framed for the government's operation. But that's neither here nor there. That's history. Another thing that FDR did was, in the name of fairness, he would see to it that certain individuals were treated much more harshly than others. And it was treatment specifically levied down by the federal tax code. These codes would deny individuals the fundamental liberty to enter the business of their own choosing. Compulsory unionism denied individuals the right to work without joining a union, and Americans gave up these liberties and more without getting out of the Great Depression at all, which was the end goal as had been promised to them. The principal legacies of the New Deal have been a massive expansion of government power, really, and the overall loss of liberty to the individual. And one of these reasons was because FDR, he viewed business as the cause of the Great Depression, and he did everything in his power and then some to restrict business. His goal was, as he said, quote, reform, not recovery. So accordingly, the New Deal would tax money away from the private sector, and government officials, not private individuals, would make the spending decisions. So for the first time ever, the power of choice was stripped from the individuals or the private entities and given specifically to the governments to lay down. The New Deal laws would determine what kind of people businesses must hire, how much they must be paid, and what prices businesses must charge, and it grossly interfered with their ability to raise capital at all. As historian Jim Powell writes in FDR's Folly, quote, "The failure of the New Deal seems incredible considering that FDR is widely rated among America's greatest presidents." He continues on and says, These and other New Dealers were hailed for their compassion and their so-called progressive thinking. They were widely viewed as more noble than the greedy businessmen and reckless speculators who were thought to have brought on the Great Depression. New Dealers wanted to eliminate poverty, abolish child labor, and right other social wrongs. Many New Dealers saw themselves as trying to make the world over. How could such bright, compassionate people have gone so wrong? End quote. And obviously, with a book title called FDR's Folly and a harsh quote on that, about FDR and his New Deal posse, it does bring up a good, valid question of how in the world did these motives that were truly well-founded take an implementation that just so bastardized the freedom and the Constitution of the United States? And what the New Deal ended up actually doing was it would impose confiscatory taxes. It made it harder for companies to raise capital at all. It made it more expensive for companies to employ the people that they already couldn't afford to employ. And it would just kind of bombard them with these dubious antitrust lawsuits and relentlessly denounce the employers and the investors. And it ended up prolonging high unemployment and greatly expanding and extending the Depression as a whole. And if there's one big takeaway from the New Deal policies and its effects on America ringing throughout today, it's that we learned that in a time of economic depression or economic downturn, or even just a valley to contrast a peak, restriction of business is the easiest way to make it worse, and allowing business and the people to transact and expand is the only real solution to alleviate that downturn. And certainly the government at the time was just blowing through money trying to boost spending and increase and fix prices. And for the first year ever in a peacetime America, the federal spending would outpace the states and the localities. I mean, the first year that had ever happened in a non-war scenario, and it still didn't make a dent in the unemployment numbers. And fast forward just a little bit, the country was now entering its 7th year of a Great Depression, and the sense of futility was stronger than it had ever been, even more so than the early 30s. Roosevelt's talk had an aspect of self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the first New Deal had not succeeded, many in the country believed that the United States was actually becoming a society of social classes that Roosevelt was describing in his speeches, and they responded accordingly. So where you would see in the old America of the Roaring '20s, the sight of so many jobless men had provoked shock and alarm, now people just accepted it. They were telling themselves that at least things were better than before. The same held for the stock traders who had stopped measuring success against the high marker of 1929. And people told themselves that the fact that the stock average was moving upward at all was the best that they could hope for. And in America, what was happening was that recovery was replacing prosperity as the end goal. For almost a solid decade, the focus on Americans, the focus on the American government, and the focus on most of the world was inward, focusing on America and focusing on the Depression and the struggles of democracy and its second real big test since breaking onto the scene in 1776. Its other test was the Civil War, as you'd remember. It was not clear if democracy was going to survive. All of the sudden, while everyone was focusing on America, stories began creeping into the forefront of the world and American minds of foreign stories. A 75-year-old treaty, and this is in the late 30s, 3940, permitted United States boats to patrol Chinese rivers. And at the end of the last year, in 1939, the Japanese had sunk a U.S. gunboat named the Panay on the Yangtze River. Roosevelt accepted an apology but took the event as a sign of perhaps more trouble was to come in the future. And in February of 1939, the papers reported that a car had carried the desperate Austrian prime minister named Kurt von Schuschnigg over the Bavarian border to Hitler's Eagle's Nest, or the Berchtesgaden. And it was at this Alps mountaintop headquarters at the Berchtesgaden that Adolf Hitler forced Schuschnigg to agree to free all the prisoners in Austria. And it was a move that could really only strengthen the Nazi regime within Austria, and essentially would open the door for Hitler's entry into the country. At this time in America, there was an increasingly isolationist attitude towards the war. Time magazine, which was furiously isolationist, it frantically tried to put a good face on the news, and they praised Schuschnigg for, quote, yielding much without yielding Austria's territorial integrity, end quote. But it was getting harder for this position not to sound very apologist, and within a month, the time looked kind of foolish because the German troops were marching into Austria even so. And it was these external forces that began to give FDR the awareness that the end might be in sight, and oddly enough, it wouldn't be something that was an internal or government-controlled decision, but it was external forces which seemingly were out of their control entirely. And again, Europe would break into the American forefront in the minds of all the people there when Hitler would threaten the Jewish population in a speech at the Reichstag, where he signaled that there would be no let-up after the Kristallnacht debacle. And the pollster, George Gallup, which the Gallup polls are now named after, he noticed that there was a shift in the American public opinion. He said, quote, a majority of Americans are now in favor of doing exactly what the Neutrality Act forbids, which was supplying Europe with arms or food. In a March 1939 poll, 76% of those polled responded yes to the question of, quote, in case war breaks out, should we sell Britain and France food supplies? And this was a massive shift, and FDR was able to use this shift in public opinion and truly just an overall great idea of the Lend-Lease Act, where we essentially supplied our allies the supplies necessary to stave off the Nazi invasion as long as possible. And it's very heavily debated whether or not Franklin Delano Roosevelt was planning on going to war or not. Regardless of what you think about that, it was one of the major aspects that pulled America out of the worst economic disaster that we will ever face, God forbid. And although at this time unemployment was starting to creep downward the way you would want it to go, it was still over 1 in 10 people unemployed. And Roosevelt knew that a war, however, would hand him the one thing that he had always lacked, a chance, quite literally, to provide jobs to the remaining unemployed people in the country. On the junket down the Potomac, for example, he could count 6,000 men at work at Langley Field, 12,000 men at Portsmouth Navy Yard, where there had been 7,600, and the new employment in the military or the prospects of it for Americans everywhere else. Roosevelt hadn't known what to do with the extra people in 1938, but now, in 39, he did. He could make them soldiers. And so it's by no small stretch of the imagination at all that World War II and the beginnings and the prospect of going into World War II were really the thing that pulled us out of the Great Depression. And it's kind of ironic that regardless of the extreme efforts that Roosevelt went to try to fix it, nothing he did worked, and it was outside forces that fixed an inside problem, and that was the only thing that seemingly would have done it. Looking back on the Great Depression and the New Deal era, it's clear that the New Deal clearly changed the country forever. And now government would always be on the national stage, whereas it was prior to that a afterthought or behind the scenes. In the 1940 election, FDR's running opponent, Willkie, he posed a rhetorical question about the change that he saw. He wondered, was the government now, with all its support, the central thing about the nation, the thing that the so-called forgotten man wanted us to remember. And the forgotten man was the person who was jobless and hungry in the last decade and couldn't find a job to literally save his life or his family life. And he posed that it wasn't. A government might help when necessary, but a government was secondary. It wasn't enough for the forgotten man, and it wasn't enough for what that forgotten man wanted us to remember. Wilkie said the forgotten man wanted us to remember, quote, his chance, his right to take part in our great American adventure, end quote. And now in 1939 and 1940, after the election, the country now seemed to remember again what it always had known before, that the adventurer was the force who pushed the country forward, from the pioneer people in the early days of westward expansion to the business people of the 20s to now, the soldiers. It was the adventurer who would push the country forward again, and it was America's adventurer that would soon become soldiers and would shortly be defending that very country. And there wasn't a single person in the country who wanted to serve his country in that adventure more than that very person, the forgotten man.